Yes. All right, thanks everybody for coming. Happy to introduce our guest speaker, Barbara Kleiss, who is a research professor at Tulane University. She's also the coordinator of their relatively new certificate program in river science and engineering. And most of the time, she's actually based up in the Vicksburg area. Her background, she got a bachelor's degree in Spring Hill College in Mobile and got to work at Dauphin Island Sea Lab while she was there. She did her master's at USM, actually, in the biological sciences program, and then a PhD at LSU. And throughout her career, she's held various leadership positions, always involving research around the lower Mississippi Valley, from sediment transport to water chemistry. And she's held a lot of positions with government. And I'll just mention one. She was the director of the U.S. Army Corps of Mississippi River Geomorphology and Potamology program. And she's been working at Tulane now, and happy to hear her share about some river science.
Great, thanks, Chris. Excited to be here. Appreciate you all spending your time this morning. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sediment in the Mississippi River, which I know isn't exactly the first thing that comes to mind for oceanographers, that I assume most of you all are, but by the end of the talk, I hope that you'll be as interested in Mississippi River sediments as we are and the history of those. As Chris mentioned, I've spent most of my career with the government. I started out working at Mobile District Corps of Engineers, switched to the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality, worked for EPA in Atlanta for a while, came over to the Engineering Research and Development Center in Vicksburg, worked at USGS and ran the Mississippi Embayment NAQUA program, which is water chemistry and biogeochemistry, went back to ERDIC, and then concluded my career with the government at the Mississippi Valley Division, which is a division office that leads the Corps of Engineers, the 6 districts that go from Canada all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Throughout all of that, I mostly work with biogeochemistry and water chemistry of wetlands and rivers and coastal areas. My degrees are technically, or my PhD is technically in oceanography from LSU, but even there I work with freshwater systems, although I've done a lot of work with coastal Louisiana now. And so when I retired, I switched over to Tulane. I got 2 or 3 slides at the end to tell you about the Tulane program, in case you have colleagues or friends that might be interested in what we're doing there. And so with that, a lot of people end their talks with acknowledgments, but I just want to start mine out. When you've been working in the field as long as I have, part of what you do is to accumulate and try to synthesize data from all different sources. And so there's really only a section, the sedimentation of bottomland hardwoods, that's my personal research. And what I'm doing for you today is basically bringing together research from a number of my colleagues and grad students and former work associates from all over. And I want to just acknowledge the folks at the Corps of Engineers, the other professors at Tulane, particularly Meade Allison, some grad students there, and then some work that I've done with USGS colleagues as well. And there's no way I could do this talk without utilizing their information. So what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try to introduce you to the whole topic of suspended sediments in the Mississippi River system. We're going to talk about the background, a little bit about the historical context, why it might still be relevant to you today, and then kind of present a conceptual model of the complexity of the situation and give you a little bit of information on different examples of changes in the watershed, and then talk a little bit about the conclusions and implications. And throughout there, and I'm going to try to emphasize some components that are particularly relevant to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, first of all, how many of y'all have seen this diagram? A few. So this is almost like this is almost like the biblical diagram for people working on the Mississippi system. This is just like the Napoleonic figures, but the idea was in 1800, this is how much sediment was coming into the Mississippi River. And by 1980, the idea was that it had minimized to that. Now, there's a couple of important things to recognize. First off, I just used the whole caption down here because it says this is an impressionistic concept. It's based on the writings of Lewis and Clark, Mark Twain, different things like that. Regardless of the fact that it's impressionistic, in the minds of most people, this is the gospel. And so there's this idea that there is over 400 million tons of sediment coming down naturally, because that's, I think, the big thing is that the assumption is that what reflected natural conditions. And I think that that's something that we need to examine. We'll talk about that. But then we'll also talk about this idea that there's still 200 million tons coming in today and what that might mean to us. And so this was developed by Mead and Moody. Robert Mead put this first together in 1995. It's still a really good thing to think about. You know, has man changed so much on the continent that it's affected the sediment load of the Mississippi? So conceptually, it's really important. How accurate it is harder to determine. Now, I know this graph, unfortunately, when they graph this out, it's not very bright, but in contrast to the idea of an impressionistic viewpoint, this is actually a catalog of all of the actual measurements that existed within the Mississippi River. Yeah, that might help, Gary. Yeah. But you see here, you see these little red marks, and then you see the purple ones here. The purple ones are Tarbert Landing. This is South Pass. But look, we got like 3 measurements from 1850. Okay, and then we've got this little section of measurements from the 1980s and 90s. You see that the air bars that they put in gray there, they're like, we don't know what that could be. All right, we don't have any idea. We got 1 measurement from the 1930s, a couple more from the 1950s, and then we start making pretty constant measurements at Tarbert Landing. So Tarbert Landing, which is just south of the old river control, right at the junction of Mississippi and Louisiana, if you think about that, that is pretty much our typecast station because it has collected data longer than any place else. But you can see from this, and Colin Thorne and his group out of University of Nottingham in England were actually on contract to the Corps to put this together. You can see that the actual data that said what the conditions were like in the 1800s is really lacking. And when they actually went back to try to identify sampling methods, a lot of these were done by basically sticking a bucket in the river and pulling the water out. Okay, so there's no equal width incremental measurements, no accounting for depth. This is probably surface water. Nonetheless, it would appear as though there's some higher values back there. So now let's look at Tarbert. This is the stuff that's pretty good, although just 2 years ago, we found a major data glitch. And so if anybody you know has Tarbert data that hasn't been updated in the last 2 or 3 years, they need to update it because it's all been corrected. And that was USGS data. But there's some really important things here. You see, generally speaking, the total suspended sediments and the fines have declined from 1965 to this goes to about 2010. This is really interesting. The suspended sands have pretty much not done anything. And you say, well, why would that make any difference? Well, we'll get to that, but one thing to think about is if you're wanting to have material for coastal restoration, you want some sands. You don't want just fine material. So let's move that into the future a bit. This is a project I did with Jenny Murphy at the USGS, and this is more recent information from Herman, Missouri, which is the last gauging station on the Missouri River before it goes into the Mississippi, and then St. Francisville, Louisiana, which is they're just south of Old River Control. And regardless of season, you see pretty marked decreases in suspended sediments in the system. And this is loads and concentrations. So definitely it would appear something is happening, right? I mean, it's not, and it's particularly marked in the spring season, but again, it's throughout the period of time. Now, the question still is, do these lumps mean anything? You know, are they important to the system? This is probably associated with the 93 flood, maybe. But, you know, it's just really difficult to say. But there does seem to be a pretty clear downward trend in sediment in the Mississippi River. So, gosh, now, 12 years ago, a while back, we were we were working on something called the Mississippi River Hydro Study, which was trying to understand what we could about designing restoration for the river. And one of the things I asked is, has anyone ever done a sediment budget for just the lower river? You know, we know that there's this decline. Can we detect the decline for the lower river? And so I got Meade Allison, this is, we were working on the project, I got Meade to lead up a group that several of us worked on to actually take the data available and to do a sediment budget for the lower river. Now, first off, what you find is that the data available is pretty sketchy. It's not as solid as you'd like it to be, but in terms of sediment. But we still got some pretty interesting things. So first off, let's look at water. If we're in Natchez, Mississippi, and this is in cubic kilometers per year, you can see that we split out at Old River Control and go to Simmsport, Louisiana, and roughly about a third of the water ends up coming down that pathway. And then the rest goes down to Belle Chase. And then the important part, and I'm going to keep stressing this over and over again, is when we get to Belle Chase, then we're distributing it across the lower Mississippi area. And one of the things that, I mean, you'll see it written, I've seen it written in newspaper articles, I've seen it written in journal articles, the Mississippi River is now a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. There is no way for water to get out. There's no contact between the Mississippi River and all the marshes. Have any of you all heard that we've blocked it? Yeah, okay, so look, we dropped from 527 to 163 out Southwest Pass. Now, this was for a 3-year period. That's an annual average, 2008, 2009, and 2010. Okay, but that was our first indication that maybe we didn't understand the system quite as well as we thought. So we continue to explore that. And then here's the sediment, the best that we could come up with associated with that. One thing that you'll find out for sure is when we got to sediment, we actually couldn't even use the data from Natchez, for instance, because it was collected a different way than the data from Baton Rouge. So we actually had to start at Tarbert and work our way down. But let me just summarize this for you, that essentially by the time we're at Tarbert Landing, and that's around River Mile 305, okay? At Tarbert Landing, we dropped from 157 down to 88, say, at Belle Chase. So almost half the sediment is no longer in suspension by the time you get to Belle Chase. And then if you start over here at Belle Chase, now we're back down here to, by the time we get out to Southwest Pass, we're down to 20 millions of tons per year on the average. Okay, and if we're looking at sand, we're down to 1.2. So this is not at all what people thought was going on. They got this, they have this image of the Mississippi River as being the big muddy, and again, you'll see it in some of the restoration plans. We have basically a unlimited supply of sediment in the Mississippi River if only we capture it and send it out to the marsh. Now, to show you one more thing, so this was 2012. We continued to look at it, and now we were looking at detailed field measurements. So this slide isn't based on dredging. It's actually based on running ADCP out in the middle of the river. And just look at 2014. If we have a flow of 850,000 CFS at Turbot Landing, by the time we get to head of passes, it's down to 369. Okay, and that pattern continues from in 2015. So we're getting about a 2/3 drop in water between Turbot Landing and head of passes. So that's water. Then, whoop, let me do that. Then we started realizing other components we're like, well, where did the water go? Well, this is a section of the river. This is about River Mile 20, Burr's Triumph. This is an old Fort Jackson. But look at the crevasses in the river there. Look at the river, just now, it's on the outside of the bend, just as it should be, right? And we've measured that during the 16 flood. These combined crevasses are 150,000 CFS going to the east side. This is going into the Mississippi bight. It's not going off of the Louisiana shelf. Okay, this is a new one. How many of you heard of Neptune Pass? Yes, I see some of you have. So since the 19 flood, this has opened up. I'm guessing it was a oil and gas canal, but the measurement I heard this spring is that 100,000 CFS is going out that opening. All right, so really interesting that, and I don't have it in this picture. You see on the west bank, there's actually a levee. On the east bank, the last of the levee is about River Mile 45. So from 45 to head of passes, there are no levees on the east side. Now, one of the things I want you to also note on that is if you look at the wetland loss maps, in spite of the fact that this is all basically the rivers open to the Gulf, there is not a ton of new wetlands being built. In fact, there's still a significant loss. So that's, I think, really important. So we explored some of that, and we're starting to see some of those losses. And then Steve Ayers from New Orleans District was doing some modeling, and he's like, I can't get my model to come out right on Southwest Pass. So he got us to fund a project with USGS to measure some of the big openings in Southwest Pass itself. So here's head of passes. This is the main navigation channel. And what he concluded that depending on the tide, these 4 outlets are capable of diverting almost half of the flow out of Southwest Pass before it even gets to the outlet. So just very recently, this is brand new. Me just finished analyzing this data about a week and a half ago, but he told me I could show it to you all. So he was working for CPRA, and he was doing suspended sediment discharge measurements. It actually had 2 different vessels out there, so this is the average of it. And this is the white sand, the yellow's total. And so if there is 90,000 tons up here at the opening to Southwest Pass, by the time you get to the bottom, it's dropped to 18,000. Okay, so this is kind of funny. Long time ago, when I was started working, when we were talking about all the big thing that was in the news was, oh, all the sediment from the Mississippi River is falling off the continental shelves. Some of the old crusty dredging guys said, the only sediment that's going off the continental shelf is what we drag out there in the hopper dredges. And it turns out they're probably not that far from the truth. You know, and like you said, even what's there is fines, not sand. And so I think it really changes the way that we think about the Mississippi River and its transport pretty significantly. And I want to spend the rest of the time going through some of the things we need to think through and research. And there's just another diagram of this where you can see what that picture showed, but essentially, you know, Southwest Pass with sand. I mean, Pass Alute, there's essentially no sand left in it. But even fines were really low values. So it's being deposited within and this was actually measurement taken in April of this year. The flow was 847,000 CFS, I think. So it was high water, a flood, but not, you know, they weren't worried about opening Bonnie Carey. So this has been pretty much of a pretty dry year, but nonetheless, this is not what people expected, I don't think, especially not the whole concept that we've heard about for years about sediment, you know, losing sediments off the continental shelf. Now, maybe we did at some point. I'm not saying that it might not have been the case in the past. So why should you care? Well, if you're in the upper part of the basin, right? If you live in the upper Midwest, this is from Minnesota, what you care about a lot there is that you don't want the fine suspended material in your rivers and lakes because it's not attractive. And the organisms there are not adapted to having high turbidity. The filter feeders and all need clear water. So I was at a meeting up in St. Louis 2 weeks ago, and one of their principal things, they are still saying that sediments are the principal source of pollutants. And if you're in Minnesota, Wisconsin, that's a big deal. And they're spending lots of money keeping sediments on ag land. Now, it's good for the farmers too, because that keeps the topsoil on their fields. But for the last 20 or 30 years, that has been a big deal in the Midwest, and they've made big changes, as I'll show you. But perhaps more importantly to this group is the whole concept that we're no longer getting the suspended materials into the deltaic plain. And if we don't figure out a way to utilize Mississippi River sediments, the land loss in coastal Louisiana will be catastrophic. And you say, well, I'm in Mississippi, what difference does that make? Well, if you don't think a hurricane coming through here and not hitting this lump before it hits Bay St. Louis matters, it matters. You know, the storms, it'll change storm surge patterns, it'll change what comes up the Pearl Basin. So you know, it does matter. So I think that and then also I think it matters heavily to a lot of you as to whether sediments coming out here. The other places I was showing, Fort St. Phillips and Neptune Pass, are in here. And it's the freshwater's moving up into this area, which I think has interest to many of you as well. So again, if you read the popular press, what's their deal? What you hear almost all the time is, oh, there's not sediment in the Mississippi because we built the dams in Missouri, on the Missouri River. And if the Dam Corps of Engineers didn't build those dams, we wouldn't have had this issue. That's number one. Number two is often that, well, there's levees on the river, and so and as almost everything, I know you all must be far enough along in your studies to recognize that anytime there's a simple solution to a problem, it's likely wrong, and that the answer is a whole lot more complex than we originally think. And so what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the period of time are my ideas of all of the different components that contribute to changes in sediment load of the Mississippi River. And even though I can show you numbers for individual ones, we are not yet at the point yet where we can combine this into a numerically solid story. But I still think it's easy to think about. And then, like I mentioned, the one that I've been personally involved with is floodplain deposition. So I'm going to do a couple slides on most of them, but then a few more on sediment deposition. So all of these slides are to get into this idea of, if we could know more about these things, could we come up with not just a conceptual model, but a numerical estimate of what's going on with the sediment loads of the Mississippi River system. So let's go a little bit into engineering background. Some of the things that are very pertinent to this. 1831 is Shreve's Cut. That's the first artificial connection between the Mississippi River and the Atchafalaya River. That made a really big deal. Recursi Cutoff is the last cutoff downstream of Eau River. In 1884, there was a no cutoff policy, and I'll explain that a little bit more. One of the huge things is that the Great Flood of 1927, it's stated that 500 people were killed, but honestly, most people believe it was much higher than that, because frankly, I think that probably means that there was 500 white folks killed, and they didn't bother counting there were other folks. And so it was quite catastrophic. And then the other thing that is really interesting about that is that particular flood, it was not only catastrophically breached the levees, but then the water stayed high until August. So the communities up and down the river, they had tent cities that they had the whole places where people were living on the levees for 6 or 7 months. So it was a big, hairy deal. That resulted in the Flood Control Act of 1928. There was another Flood Control Act of 1938. They built some more levees. And then there was in 28, they put a bunch of levees in. And then 32, there was another very significant flood. And the general who was in charge of the Mississippi River Commission at that time was called up to DC. His name was General Ferguson, and the commander of the Corps of Engineers at that time in DC said, "Damn it, Fergie, fix the river." And so they started what's called the cutoff program that I'll tell you a little bit about, that's still having an impact to the river today. In 1954, they completed the Morganza cutoff spillway. In 1961, they dammed it was the last of the the Missouri River big reservoir constructions and dams. In 63, we completed the overbank and the low sill structures. And then the Great Flood of 1937, it partially undermined the old river control structures, and they built another auxiliary structure. Also important is 1990, there's a hydropower plant that went online that has first right of refusal for all of the Mississippi River waters. So they worked out a political deal in Louisiana. That's never happened before, right? But the hydropower plant provides all of the electricity for the towns there. And then a lot of people don't realize, but the flood of 2011 was actually in some places higher than the one in 27. Okay, so just to go through this a little bit, if you're, here you all are sitting right over here. This is what we call the plumbing diagram for the Mississippi River. Traditionally, the idea was most of the water came out of the Ohio system, but most of the sediment came out of the Missouri system. So this is a water diagram. This little thin line right here is probably what's being, we're most suspicious about, because the last couple of floods, much more water than anticipated came out of the upper Miss. We think that is due to climate change. We think that the Minnesota-Wisconsin area is getting more rainfall than, or has gotten more rainfall than before the last 15, 20 years. You know, whether that's a cycle or whether it's climate change that will continue, we still have to watch, but that's a really important component. But then when we get down here, this is the old river control complex, and as much as 600,000 CFS can go down here past Morgan City out into the Gulf, into the Atchafalaya system. And to be honest with you, during 11, it was more than 6. I think we passed as much as 720,000. So we actually exceeded that. This is the area that I think that you all are most aware of, which is the Bonnie Carey spillway. And the purpose of Bonnie Carey is to maintain the flow past New Orleans at 1.25 million CFS, because the levees in New Orleans are not built to withstand an elevation greater than 17 feet. Okay, so what it's doing is it's taking water through, out of the river into Lake Pontchartrain and into Mississippi Sound. And I suspect a number of you all are working with that. You know, and essentially, if you think about the politics in 1927, this whole plumbing diagram was created to protect population centers. They weren't thinking about oysters. They weren't thinking about hypoxia. They weren't thinking about anything else except for to protect the population center in New Orleans. Okay, and some of you may know that both the operation of this and the operation of this have been the subject of legal battles. And, you know, primarily Mississippi relative to the way the New Orleans District Corps runs it. And they probably should be, frankly. It's just because the way that it was set up was for a different time and age. But you should also know that the Corps of Engineers does not have the authority to just change it on their own. The way that those structures are operated are actually written in law, and it would literally take an act of Congress to be able to change that. Now, should there be one? That's a really good question. And in fact, there's a authorized study. It's not appropriated, but it's authorized, called the Mississippi River Comp Plan, that is designed to take a look at some of those things. Whether we'll get to that because it requires a cost-sharing partner or not, we don't really know. But the Corps is talking to folks in Mississippi, Louisiana, et cetera, about cost-sharing sections of that study. Okay, so that's background. I think it might be something you find interesting. This is also interesting. This is the cutoff program. When they told General Ferguson, that he had to fix the river, there was a real controversial idea out called the cutoff program. Okay, so the idea is if you took a meander bend of the Mississippi River like this, and you dredged out this, and you essentially created a net cutoff, you would change the slope of the river, and you would run floodwaters past the area quicker, and the increased velocity would deepen the channel, and you would decrease your flood elevations. So in fact, they cut off, I think it's 16 artificial cutoffs, and then during the program, 1 cutoff naturally. Prior to that, there'd been a no cutoff policy. So here's the locations of all of the cutoffs. The last one's just south of Natchez. The first one's just south of Memphis. They shortened that section of the river 150 miles. And it's about a 1,000-mile section of the river, 800, I guess, between that. So they took off almost 25% of the length of the river, which is an incredible change in a river system, just incredible. And it's something that today I can't imagine that would ever happen. But Fergie had to fix the river, right? And in fact, up here in this Greenville area, and that is where the levees breached, just north of Greenville is where the levees breached during the flood of 27. So it was for the same flow of 1 million CFS, they dropped the stage 14 or 15 feet. Okay, so so from a viewpoint of strictly flood control in the 1930s and 1940s, it was horribly successful. Okay, but you guys tell me, what do you think shortening the course of the river by 150 miles might do? Anybody? Okay. What's that?
Reduce the amount of sediment?
Or could it gain it? Because could it increase it at that point because the velocity has increased because the slope has changed? And so that's what we find a lot of, is that in this section of the river, that it basically washed the sediment downstream, right? It became erosional. And then it created a head cut, okay, because we changed that in the gully, but it created a head cut, and that's actually working its way through the system. It went through Memphis, where because of the slope, there was almost like a little underwater water, not a little, a big underwater waterfall that's cutting the bank of the bottom of the river. It's up to about Hickman, Kentucky now. Okay, so it released that sediment. Where do you suppose it put it all? Down in the bottom of it, where there wasn't cutoffs. So this section of the river is aggrading. It's filling up. This section of the river is degrading. All right, all because of something that they did in 1940. And it's not done. You would think, okay, you know, a lot of, I mean, think about even some of our projects. We monitor them for 10 years. Big whoop, right? So this is nearly 80 years later, and we're still seeing signs of it. And I'm not even sure we're considering all of the implications of that. Okay, so along those lines, let's think about channel stabilization. Back in the 1890s, they actually used what they called willow mats. They cut down willow trees, because there were a lot of them near the river, weave them all together to protect the side of the river so that when it meanders, it didn't cut so badly. By post-World War II, we got a lot more sophisticated. In 1947, we came up with this giant structure called the mat sinking unit, and we make these concrete mats. These are all joined together by cables. The way I like to think about them is, you know those little bamboo mats you use to make sushi that are real flexible? They're doing that, but it's doing it with concrete and cable, steel cables. It goes from about the thowag of the river all the way up to the bank and is then anchored into the bank. At this point, every outside bend of the river between Memphis and New Orleans, well, no, Memphis and probably Belle Chase, every outside bend on the river is coated with this concrete mat. Every single one. Now that's great if you're trying to protect your levee, number one, or you're trying to protect the town behind the levee. But what does that, again, do to the overall situation of the river? So this is a really cool study that a Tulane grad student that just finished about 2-3 years ago and is up at ERDIC is doing. She actually went back to the maps and digitized the bank line from the old maps all the way back from 1765 to the current configuration, and basically use cores from the FISC maps to estimate the height of the bank and created a volume measurement of all of the meander bends. Okay, and what this showed, we stopped in 92 because by 92, everything had been so revetted that the river configuration, the plan form of the river, has basically not changed since 92. Okay, but look at the amount of sediment supplied by bank erosion, how it changed. So we go back to the 1700s. We see these first 1800s, pretty stable. But look what happened in the late 80s all the way to like 1930. The amount of material that was introduced into the stream by erosional features, was huge at that point. And then we had the cutoffs, and then we stabilized, and this is what it is today. This is what it is since 1992. Okay, so the amount of sediment introduced to the river is reduced by almost 96% compared to what it was in 87 to 1931. Now, I think that 1931 to 46 was, this period, this 87 to 31, that was abnormally high, right? That was when, and we'll go through a few of the reasons there, but that was when we were developing the river. We took no environmental care whatsoever. We were clearing out the prairie, we were clearing out forest. But one of the things I think is really interesting is, does anybody know the first date for the Louisiana wetland loss? What the earliest images that they use are? When they say, oh, we've lost this much. We've lost, since the beginning. You know when the beginning was? 1932 is the oldest aerial photos they have of the wetlands. Okay? So I always am haunted by the fact is, do the wetland maps from Louisiana, do they reflect this massive amount of sediment moving down the continent? I don't think we know that. We know that there was all kinds of sediment moving through the system at that period of time, but is 1932 a really great date to begin saying that wetland loss is a percentage of what was there in 1932? And I think that's an interesting question. So here's another reason. I said that in the 1800s, the river was unstable. There was a lot of sediment being introduced because of man. Well, this is an interesting story that I hadn't even heard of until about 10 years ago. You realize that when we were using the river for steamboats, so where did the steamboats get their fuel? Well, there was a whole industry of timber boats who would have people cutting down trees, and then they would run the logs out to the steamboats, go alongside the steamboats and hand up the logs. So where do you suppose they got the trees from? Right along the banks of the river, right? So they destabilized. So that went on for decades. And in fact, just last week, I found a diary account from like 1845. Somebody's grandfather in Indiana, or great-great-grandfather in Indiana, was 23 and he didn't have winter work. So he came down to Louisiana to be on one of the timber teams for the steamboats. So they denuded tremendous amount of the banks of the river. And we were doing that kind of thing throughout the watershed, right? And so this whole idea of when the river was stable, when it was in equilibrium, when we basically lost control of the sediment of the river, and how that relates back to both sediment transport and our big diagram at the beginning, the giant 400 million tons of sediment in 1800. Do we have a pre-anthropogenic figure for what it really was, or is our image just based completely on the 1800s when, frankly, we were doing enough harm to just mess things up? And I think that's a really important decision or thing to think about. Here's one of the other things is that, okay, that's the collapse of the banks. But the other thing we've done is we need to begin to measure sandbar deposition within the rivers itself. And so this is just an example on the Missouri River. This is what the Missouri looked like in 1934. You can see this bay right back in here. They decided they needed to make the Thalweg, move the water into the main flow of the river for navigation. So they built this jetty system in November of 1934. By 36, you already see the sediments coming down by those jetties. And then by 46, you see everything they built was trees right down. And so they made the channel narrower so it would be self-scouring. You can see now how much more a boat pilot would like to see the river then, right? And here's another example of a massive sandbar. And the same folks that did the bank caving study are now starting a sandbar survey over time to see if we can get some idea of the volume of sands and sediments that are caught up in sandbars along the banks of the river relative to the erosion. Now there is no doubt that the Missouri River base dams were a tremendous impact to the system. You may or may not know there's 6 huge major reservoirs on the Missouri. They're built for flood control, but also hydropower and water supply. This one right here, Owyhee, is the largest reservoir in the entire United States. It has the 4th greatest volume. Combined, they have 73.4 million acre feet of combined storage, massive amounts of storage. And I've worked a lot with the guys in Omaha on this. And when you get to the farthest one downstream, this is Lewis and Clark Lake or Gavin's Point, Yankton, South Dakota is right here. The sediment concentrations coming out at Yankton are essentially 0. So this series of dams completely traps sediments from the Missouri River to that point. And of course, that's led people to say, oh, well, that's why we don't have sediment concentrations on the Mississippi River anymore. And it did contribute. But one of the things that we've done, Meade did this work with Dave Biedenharn and Charlie Little, is that if we up here at 0 at Yankton, if you measure all of the stations, by the time you get to Herman, which is the last gauge before the junction of the Mississippi, it's back up to half of the sediment flow. So we have decreased it, but we've only cut it by 50%, 40-50%, not 0. And why would that be? Well, that's because if you've got water with lots of energy leaving the last reservoir, it's essentially going to pick up sediment from the remaining 700 miles of the Missouri River. A lot of people don't understand that this distance is 700 river miles. And so it's picked up a lot of sediment, and so it is lower, but just the decrease from the Missouri doesn't explain the total difference. Spillways. Spillways remove water from it. This is the Bonnie Carey in north of New Orleans. This is the Mississippi River. This is the spillway. This is the water heading off to Lake Pontchartrain. And so that's operates anytime it's more than 1.25 million CFS. And I'm sure you all are aware of the fact that it operated more in the last decade than the whole rest of its life. Here's an example of, this is the auxiliary structure at Old River Control. This is the one that I think can combine with the other structures up there, can go to bird about 1/3 or 30% roughly of the water. So what impacts do spillways have? Well, one of the things that's sort of interesting is this idea of slope and stream power. And stream power is discharge times slope, and how it changes as you go through the system. So these are towns. This is like Wickliffe, Kentucky, to Caruthersville. You know, you're going down the river. So here is Memphis, Helena, Rosedale, Ark City. As you go down here, we end up at Red River Landing and Baton Rouge. So what's interesting is, in every case, the stream power has actually increased over time. Okay, so it's carrying more material. But when we get down here, look at from, these all are dates. Look what happens when we get down to Red River Landing to Baton Rouge. And essentially what happens is we take off Old River, clearly, that's an easy one. But it's also where we get to the coastal plain. So we have the continent that's kind of, the continental area that's kind of at this slope that's actually been exacerbated by the cutoff program. Now we flattened out. So naturally, What's in the river at St. Francisville is not, the river no longer has the same power. And then remember, we talked about all the other outlets as we went through. And so essentially, we don't have a powerful river. When we created the coast of this area, the Mississippi River was flooding at sometimes 2.5 million CFS. It was swinging all over the place, right? There was no controls for it, and it had tremendous power. Now, because of the way we have it set up, it never gets more than, once we get past New Orleans, it never gets more than 1.25 million CFS. And stream power is a geometric number, not a linear number. So the ability of the river to move sediment is much less now than it was historically. Another component, land use. I mentioned that. The folks in the Midwest, they don't like muddy water. We kind of get used to it down here a little bit, right? But this is just one state. This is their advertising in 2019 about the number of no-till acreage and the cover crop acreage that they put in for their corn and soybeans. And they're claiming that over 1 million tons of sediment were saved in that year alone. Well, the current flow of the Mississippi River is, the current discharge of sediment is somewhere between 100 and 150. So that means one state for one set of things affects 1 million, or a significant portion of that total, right? Only 1% maybe, but if every state's 1%, it ends up over decades making a difference. So this, I'm going to show you the floodplain deposition. So this is my dissertation, and it was so long ago, there's no digital copies of it, so I had to take a photograph from the reprint, right? So that's why this looks so, but I was looking at deposition in wetlands from the viewpoint of water chemistry. Could we remove sediment out of the water column? So what I did is the Cache River is over here in Arkansas, the Arkansas Cache River. This is the natural levee of the river, the first bottom, and then as you move across the floodplain, about 1,400 meters from the river. And what I found there was, not too surprisingly, that yes, there's deposition on the natural levee, and then big time there was deposition of sediments, particularly fine sediments on the first bottom and bottomland, and that was essentially cypress swamp. Okay, the interesting thing is that following traditional fluvial geomorphology, that should have been the maximum deposition. This should have been less. But in this particular area, there was extraordinarily fine sediments, very fine clays. And so the clays could go over the top of the natural levee, and they were preferentially filling the first bottom. And that can matter because it'll change the geomorphology. Well, when this was way back in 1990, all these years I've been kind of wondering about, well, I wonder how this works on other rivers. Finally, by the time I got to Tulane, this whole issue of floodplain worked again. One of the first things we did was map the batture. The batture is the French word for the floodplain, the area between the levees. If you're only from New Orleans, or the only time you mess with the Mississippi River is when you go over to the French Quarter and you're drinking your hurricane while you're looking off the levee, you get the impression that the entire river is only a mile or so across, because that's what everyone sees. Probably, 90% of the people who see the Mississippi River see it in the French Quarter, right? But the thing is, once you get north of Baton Rouge, this is the actual width of the floodplain. I mean, there's places here where the floodplain's still 14 miles across. You've totaled this all out, there's still 1.8 million acres of flooded forested wetlands between Memphis and Baton Rouge, which isn't as great as the 20 million acres that was probably there before we put levees in, but 1.8 million acres of forested wetland is still a lot of wetland. And so we're like, well, what is the function of that with the Mississippi?
A little short on time.
Yep. I'll try to wrap that up. And so to make that short, we're looking at Cat Island at the National Wetlands, at the Wildlife Refuge there. And what we found was significant deposition of sediment in the wetlands. And so we put out clay pads, which is kind of cool. You put feldspar clay and mark it. You can see there deposition above it. And what our conclusion is that even the section of the floodplain between Old River Control and Baton Rouge might trap as much as 10% of the total load of the sediment load of the river. Okay, so let me just go ahead and beat that. That's some cool swamps. You see the pictures there. Now we are depositing on the natural levees. And that's what one of the things that we're seeing there is that the channel proximity, and the thing that's important there is to understanding the energy of the river. Okay, so I'm going to conclude it there. First off, the Mississippi River is not a pipeline of water and sediment to the open Gulf. I think it's still important to understand whether sediments are a curse or a boon. It depends on which part of the country you're in. We really have to understand the sources to sink concept. Was 1932 a great baseline for this? Are we attaching adequate value to the water and sediment of the river, especially in this period of drought? Perhaps we're not. And so all of this has implications for wetland restoration. And Chris and I were talking about it. I also feel like it has implications of whether we adequately understand. We all know that the traditional hypoxic zone, dead zone, has been depicted as being west of the Mississippi River and the Louisiana shelf. Most of the diagrams actually have it cut off straight at the Texas-Louisiana line. But how much is it really affecting the Mississippi Sound? And do these new openings of the river to the east make a difference to that? And I think that that's what you all might be interested in. And I think I'll stop right there, Chris, because I know we are really close on time. Exactly 12 o'clock.
We'll take some questions here, but I also want to say if anybody wants to talk more with Barb, she's here for the afternoon, and there's a couple slots left in the afternoon schedule. So any questions in the room or online?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. With regard to the 1932 as an appropriate baseline, if we were not going to use that as a baseline, what would you posit would be a good
Well, see,
metric,
that's
and how would we actually determine
see, that's
if-
the problem. We don't have any photography from before that, right? We have maps, hand-drawn maps of some of the areas, but you know, some of those, I mean, those are going to be of mixed quality, right? And so, yeah, no, I think that's the problem. We're using the best one we have available, but you know, maybe we need to look at the trends. Like, for example, the trend from 2010 till now has slowed down considerably as compared to prior to that. So there's just a lot to learn yet about causes. Anyone else?
So with, you know, thinking about the sediment flux, and you had the diagram, you know, kind of going from you know, through the drainage basin. Did the sediment flux kind of like add up to, you know, the starting, you know, part of it to the ending part of it, first of all?
Well, like I said, we haven't even tried to do that. And
Okay.
part of the problem is that it's measured by so many different techniques. But that is one of our goals, is to get some, you know, just some numbers out so people can shoot arrows at it, because that's all it'll be. It'll be like a wag.
Mm-hmm.
But no, it has not total. We have
Yeah.
not been able to total. And part of it is we don't understand storage. Like, how long does sediment stay in the channel? Does it stay for many years until there's a giant flood and then move a slug of it through? we don't
Right.
know that yet.
And actually, one of the things you said, I was really kind of caught my attention because, as you point out, a lot of this has important implications for restoration and diversion. You said that kind of along the lower river and the lower delta, where there's no levees or limited levees, even though there's high flow through those areas, there's no wetlands being built
There,
in some of those areas,
there
right?
are some.
Okay.
I mean, you can see mud flats building
Mhm.
and things like that. But if you were to even just go back to one of those openings, so there's a great report that Glenn Seward did that actually followed the opening of Fort St. Philip's in '73. For about the first 25 or 30 years, there's actually a net loss of wetlands. And it wasn't until after 25 years or so that things were sufficiently non-energetic to start to build wetlands. And you can even just look in Google Earth and go, use the time slider and look at the wetland maps, loss maps over time. And there's not massive amounts of wetlands. There's little places here and there. So it's not that it's completely ineffective. It's that the question about the amount being built within human time spans is of interest, I think.
Mm-hmm. And that's based on the kind of low sediment flux, or suspended sediment, bed load, and high energy during the crevasse.
High energy subsidence and sea level rise.
So what are the implications, do you think, for the diversions then?
I still think there's implications that we need to examine. Let me just leave it at that. I think that, and if you look at if you've looked at the permit application that's out right now, it basically says that in 30 or 40 years we'll have 20,000 acres of wetlands, and then sea level rise is projected to accelerate and it'll drop back to 13,000. So at the end of 50 years, even the permit application says that there'll only be a net gain of 13,000 acres. And so, and again, is sea level rise cyclical? There's some indication that is now. Is subsidence slowing down? There's some indications of that. We're talking about all these drivers that we can't really predict.
Thank you.
All right. I think we'll take one more question. Shara online has a question. You want to go ahead, Shara?
Yes, that was a very thorough and applicable to my research presentation. I really appreciate that. My only question I'll leave everyone with is, in 2009, there was a very pessimistic conclusion by some people who said that there is not, that river sediment in Louisiana or coming down the Mississippi is insufficient, and that Louisiana deltaic coastal plains drowning is inevitable. And I was wondering if that's still the consensus.
So that's the Blum and Roberts paper, I'm assuming?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. I still feel as though we need to, their calculations are legitimate calculations. Whether all of their assumptions are correct or not, it's almost like the discussion we just had, right? If you put the error bars into some of their assumptions, it goes the whole range from we can sustain it to we can't sustain it at all. And sadly, that's just where we are right now. There's the error bars associated with it, but I think that the Blum and Roberts paper has a cautionary tale in it that we should understand represents one end of the error bars, and presents a possible future, and that we can't discard it. We can't discard it as nonsense, because those guys aren't nonsense, right? And so, but we also have to continually work, and especially you younger folks have to continually work on refining those error bars and deciding where we're at over the next 100 years or more. Does that help?
Yes. I do have one more question, but I do have an appointment with you at 3:30, so I'll ask you then.
Okay, we'll do
But
it
thank
then.
you so much.
All right, great. We'll talk to you more then.
All right, let's thank Barb again.
Enjoyed it. Thanks so much for your attention.